Before we move on to section 3.3, let's put everything together that we've covered so far. When you're summarizing a numerical data distribution, you want to select the appropriate measures of center and variability. You determine that based on the shape of the distribution. So we've learned how to calculate the mean and the standard deviation for symmetric data distributions. Then you calculate with the values for the selected measures, typically by using software. Now, we will interpret the values in context, and that just means that we provide the mean and the standard deviation for symmetric distributions, and we explain that that is the center and the amount of variation. So we can look at an example here if we are looking at this article, How to Confuse Thirsty Bats, which was published in the journal Nature Communications. So the article was looking at echolocation. So echolocating bats have a legendary ability to find prey in the dark. So you'd think that they'd be able to tell the difference between water and a sheet of metal. But in this study, they found that this was not the case. They found that bats identify any extended echoacoustically smooth surface as water, and they will try to drink from it. The way that they made that conclusion was they had a study where bats were placed in a room that had two large plates on the floor. One was made of wood and had an irregular surface, and the other was metal and had a smooth surface. They found that the bats never attempted to drink from that wooden irregular surface, but they made repeated attempts to drink from the smooth metal surface. And here we have data from how many attempts these 11 bats made. We see that there were a few bats that made many attempts and a few bats that made hardly any at all. If we looked at a dot plot here, even though it's quite spread out, it's really not asymmetric. So we would report the mean and the standard deviation here since there are no extreme outliers and it's relatively symmetric. So using StatCrunch, you would get the values for X bar, 69.09. If you wanted the variance, StatCrunch will calculate it. You'll get 3,175.49, and S is 56.35. But the type of interpretation that you should make is this, saying on average, the bats in the sample made 69.09 attempts to drink from that smooth metal surface. The sample standard deviation is 56.35. Notice that the sample standard deviation is quite large compared to that sample mean, and that would tell us that there was a lot of variability from bat to bat in the number of drinking attempts. So when we have these interpretations, we're going to put them into context by describing to people what we found and the implication of that sample standard deviation being large or small relative to the sample mean.